Welcome everybody to the next season of the Impact Policy Podcast. We're off country today. You might notice we're in a bit of a different setting and we're a long way from Gadigal country in Glebe. So we're down here on Ngunnawal country. I want to take a moment to acknowledge and pay our deepest respects to our elders, both past and present here. Thank them for a safe journey down here early in the morning and for giving us the opportunity to share space with Vanessa, who's sitting here with us this morning. Very proud Bundjalung woman who is been very much a trailblazer for our people and very much leading some significant and critical work for our young people and families. And it's been a journey to share space with you and really such a privilege to get to be able to hold this space together, do a bit of a deep dive into the impact and journey of your work and where we hope to go in this sort of space. And what people can really take away from here that are leaders, decision makers, people on the front line and our community as well. So thanks so much for being here. We really know that people listening will get so much out of today's episode. And I might just give you a brief opportunity to introduce yourself and just share with people that are listening where you're at right now, what you're doing and what that sort of means.
Thank you, Brother Sam. I just also like to take a moment to acknowledge Ngunnawal people, our country and place. Whilst, you've probably noticed it's a bit of concrete jungle down here, there is such a strength and beauty to being in this place and we're being held. So I also acknowledge, what we're being held by on this place. So thank you and thank you for this beautiful acknowledgement. I feel like we've been waiting a couple of years to do this podcast and maybe that was for a reason. I don't know. But no, it's a real pleasure to be here. As you said, I'm Vanessa Turnbull-Roberts and I'm a proud Bundjalung Widjabul woman. So my family come from the mid-north coast of New South Wales. My great-grandmother, May Brown from Cubberwee in Cavatree Island, my pop, Albie Roberts. And what I love about sharing that little bit of an introduction is our stories and places where we belong are so critical to kind of where we are today. I spent a lot of my time growing up on Gadigal country and so it's really nice to be a visitor here on Ngunnawal country and see you come down from Gadigal country and share this space. And of course, where I come from, the historical resilience of mob from up north coming down to Gadigal and the way we carry that strength internally. So again, thank you. But long yarn short, I am the inaugural Commissioner for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children and Young People for the ACT. So newly appointed.
First of its kind?
First of its kind in the ACT and first of its kind with the statutory powers and functions that we actually have. Okay. And in saying that, there are commissioners and people working within other states and territories, and of course we have federal commissioners as well. But I think one of the most unique things about this role is that it does hold independent statutory functions and powers, which I'm sure we'll speak to in terms of what does the role mean and the independent oversight that we have with actually ensuring that we have eyes on our children and young people. And when there is a power imbalance, that actually community can come to our office and say, this is happening, or a child or young person who has needs that have to be met, that aren't being met or being breached, we can go in and advocate for that child or young person with actual statutory powers that back us in doing that. I'm a again proud Bundjalung Widjabul woman and an advocate for human rights. So a lot of my background is within the legal space and children's rights. And when I talk about human rights and I do that introduction, I try and share that our human rights are so different to, I guess, the world definition of human rights. We have our cultural rights and our sovereign rights. And because of such a strong history and denial of our rights and children's right to country, to place and community, we're met by what we're seeing now, so many implications of the system and its violence towards our people. And because of lack of understanding of those children's rights and cultural rights of who we are, we start seeing a silence on our people. So I bit in that field. I love a yarn. And I'm very fortunate that my book's coming out at the end of the year called Long Yarn Short. So if this podcast does go over, I apologise.
That's the title of this podcast. I'm going to
Long Yarn
if
Short.
I can. Yeah, maybe. Unless that's privy information and that hasn't gone public yet. We always try and think of a title for each episode, but that's a great title for the book. Mad.
Thank you.
I think many people that would be familiar with your profile and your journey would know that you have significant lived experience and connection to this sort of space, and we can have a bit of a yarn if you're comfortable about that sort of stuff. But before we sort of go there, I'd really love to ask you about, you've touched on some of the complexities around the forced child removal, family policing, and justice sort of pipeline space.
Mm-hmm.
People that are listening along, what do you sort of see as some of the most critical sort of things that we need to be focusing on right now, from a policy perspective, from a systems perspective, from an advocacy perspective, or even just from your experience in your role? Like, what are you seeing as like some of the key sort of things right now we need to be focusing on?
Thanks, Sam. I think in terms of what we need to be driving a massive shift around and focusing is looking at the strengths of our children and young people and families. I'm very privileged to sit in a commissioner's role where I'm directly working with families, but then also I sit in stakeholder engagement where we're advocating to ministers, to policymakers. When there's new legislations coming in, we're at that table and we're discussing what needs to change. And it's quite alarming that what I'm seeing on the ground is, and I've said this before, I've said it in my advocacy, I've lived it, I've watched my own family face it, is we have developed a system where we punish poverty and we, instead of actually, it's going to sound cheesy, but instead of actually adopting a holistic approach and supporting women, children, families, we often are reactive instead of proactive.
Yeah.
And so in the work that I'm seeing, I see survivors of domestic and family violence who are often victims when their child's taken, but no doubt they are survivors and will survive if they are lucky, if in terms of their safety in that situation. But what I see is with domestic and family violence victim survivors is when there is a situation happening within the family unit, often care and protection, family policing agencies are extremely reactive and remove that child. And I think that when it comes to particularly our women and children, we need to reshift that whole approach on how we support our young people. We are leaning towards, we're not leaning towards, we are at a national crisis when it comes to family policing. And when it comes to the criminal justice system. And often they change the language where they say it's called youth detention, it's not really considered incarceration. Well, I'm sorry, the reality is if you are subjecting our children and young people to youth detention, you are ultimately putting them in the university to get an undergraduate degree to send them to adult incarceration. And we're seeing the same issues in youth detention / incarceration in prisons. We're seeing it. And so for me, when I look at the work and I see what I'm reading, every morning I receive, a list of how many young people are subject to youth detention from the weekend or the week or the day before.
Yeah, wow.
Almost more than half of those children and young people are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, sit on care and protection orders.
Yeah.
So what I say is we need to start enforcing accountability and recognising that if the state cannot be your parent, which we know it can't,
absolutely.
Why, when they have a child in their care and responsibility, i.e. a ward of the state, why is that child or young person then ending up in youth detention criminal justice systems? And why is the onus not being placed back on those systems and saying, where was your parenting? Where was your ability to actually protect this child? Because if that child had been with their birthing family, biological community or kin, no doubt there would have been pathologising. No doubt there would have been bias and prediction used on that community to say, well, you have an inability to parent, so we're going to remove your child. Right. And so for me, when I see this happening in work and I'm working directly with families and I see the disempowerment of our parents who are just fighting to their last breath, equally often and sometimes struggling at the same time.
Yeah.
Addiction exists, struggle exists.
Absolutely.
But instead of going, straight to, I love what Brother Joe Williams says, stop tackling the diagnosis and start reflecting on the symptoms.
Yep.
What's happening that drew that person to maybe where they are today, and why are we enforcing more punishment instead of support? Because we know what works and we know what isn't working, and right now it's not working at all.
Absolutely. Yeah, that really, really well-informed, trauma-informed ways of working. I think Joe really tackles in on, is not treating like the symptoms are a manifestation of the trauma.
Yeah.
And we see that so often with the criminalisation of poverty and neglect, is that much of the issues around addiction and mental health and other factors that might be there, we know that they're manifestations of either direct trauma or intergenerational trauma that our families have experienced.
Absolutely.
Massive space. Massive
Very.
space that you're navigating.
Very.
And I can imagine one that is, I saw your post when you took up the role, and I think the most, if it was like a post on Instagram and, a formal announcement. And
You do your background homework, don't you?
try
You
my
say
best.
everything.
I know you well enough, but
I gotta watch what I put out
still do
there.
a bit of a stalk. But the first line was like, it is with a heavy heart that you take up this role. And I think like that really, it really resonated with me. It was as a survivor as well, as someone with lived experience doing this work, that I think it's important to really acknowledge how much heavier it is for you as commissioner in this space, how much more weight is on your shoulders because of your strength. I just want to acknowledge that, because I don't think it's something that doesn't get held enough for our people working in this space that are survivors, that have that lived expertise, to be really navigating and doing the work, And I think that sort of leads into what I want to ask around, maybe more of a personal question, is how do you do this stuff personally, like as a survivor in that context? Myself personally, when I was in the community sector more broadly, I burnt out. I would find myself getting triggered. I'd be working with families that had experienced similar stuff to what I'd had as a child, or I'd be working with, family friends of people I've grown, like stuff. It got to a point where it was a bit too much. I've developed mechanisms since then, but I guess what I'm trying to ask is how do you navigate such a significant role, such a load on your shoulders, but with such a critical insight and voice that's needed at the table?
I think going back to when you said you picked up on, that the heavy heart, and I intentionally wrote it is with heavy heart, because I just think when we look at history and what's happened to our people, how do we fast forward now and to even who would be my children, that we're still continuing the same practices and policies of history. We're seeing the seeds flourish today, but they're not flourishing to being the beautiful sunflowers. They're flourishing to be the pain and the harm that our children are subject to, and we're seeing what that has done to our people. And so for me, when I wrote, it is with a heavy heart that I accept the appointment as being Commissioner for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people. For me, it was a bit of a relief, but also that extreme pain that it has to exist, this role, because we know the current regimes are not working. So when I made the decision to accept the appointment as Commissioner, and recognising that, yes, I have professional expertise in this area, but most importantly, I looked back on my own story, and I looked back as being a child and young person, and now as a survivor. And I think about the treatment that my own parents were subject to. The way if my parents didn't dress a certain way, well, clearly they're inadequate and can't raise me. The way they were disrespected, the way they were completely disempowered, from case meetings to conferences to courtrooms.
Absolutely.
And I think I had this yarn with my sister the other day, and I just said, I feel so incredibly privileged that, one, these families and communities feel safe to come to me and say this is happening, but two, that I get to sit in that room and say, actually, no, there is something fundamentally wrong here.
Yeah.
And as a child, I said to my sister, I don't even know if there was anyone doing that for me.
Yeah.
I had caseworkers, social workers, had all these teachers at school who were always, not necessarily speaking down on me, but you always were reminded that you were different.
Yeah.
And I always wondered as a child, was there someone that actually knew what I needed? Was there someone that actually heard me? And was there someone that was supporting my parents? And this is where I advocate so strongly around the child-parent relationship, and not necessarily, yes, I'm not naive to problems existing,
Absolutely.
but what are we actually doing to, one, harm minimise, and to strengthen the relationship without enforcing more trauma on that child or young person? And so for me, when I was forcibly removed and going from foster home to foster home, and then when you get brought into that long-term order, for me, the long-term order and the onus then lays on the foster carers, and that access to your family and your community is incredibly limited.
Absolutely.
And so I always wondered, was there someone there to go and advocate for the other family members to come to and say, this is wrong and what can I do about it?
Yeah.
And what I see in this job and how I manage it is actually I get to be at that table. For the first time ever, I'm sitting at conference rooms and I represent that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander child or young person from a perspective that probably isn't heard at the table. And one of the most disheartening part is often people do know what's going on, but people are terrified. People are terrified to do something incredibly different in this field because they're afraid of, well, we might reach the worst case, and what if something happens, and what if we can't, mitigate a situation that we could have done previously, or what if we can't fix what could happen? And for me, we were already at worst case scenario.
Yeah, exactly.
We are at worst case scenario. And so how I manage this role, and you've probably picked up from a bit of the work you've probably investigated already, but I'm a bit of a futurist, and so I think about the future, and that's how our people have always been thinking. What's in it for our grandchildren? What's in it for our great grandchildren?
Nice.
What seeds am I planting for them to actually flourish? That aren't seeds necessarily from violence, but seeds from love and strength of who we are, and that's how I'm building this commissioner's office and this team. Is we've got an incredible frontline advocate, senior caseworker. We've got policy researchers on board. We've also got commissioners from all the different states and territories who are holding me with such love and strength. And that's the difference. This role didn't come from government realising that there's a gap. Yeah. This role came from community. This role came out of the Our Borais, Our Ways committee that said, no, we need to see independent oversight. And so I came into a role already where I was held by community. I was respected. I went through what they would call two processes, the community and the formal panel. Yeah. And for me, in my heart, the community was my formal panel.
Absolutely.
And that's what I held close to my heart, because that's who I'm representing, that's where my interest lays, and that's where I need to make sure our children and young people are coming back home to. And so for me, knowing that I've come into a space where I am so held by community, I have the opportunity to bring those voices to ministers, to community. And it was through, I know this word's cheesy, and I saw some commentary on it the other night, but it was through that co-design process that actually said, no, we need to do something about it.
Yeah.
And so that's how I hold. And again, building our team and building our office, I'm not building it I'm here for 5 years. That's my statutory appointment time. But I'm thinking 15 years, I'm thinking 20 years, I'm thinking what does it look like so it can be easier, but also, and this is where I think leadership is so important. If I was to pass away tomorrow, if something was to happen to me where I couldn't come into the role, I need to make sure that the office and the representation and the advocacy can still work. Leadership is about knowing that if you weren't there, if you weren't present on this earth, if you transformed wherever you needed to transform to, that can still remain intact, because that's, you're setting up, you're not holding all the power yourself, you're not working on ego, you're not working on I know what's right, you're working on actually we know what's right together, and it's going to work.
Yeah, beautiful.
So that's how I maintain in terms of being a survivor, and there's strength in being a survivor and being in these positions. There's strength in you're sitting around a table often with people that don't know what it's like, that haven't had the experience.
Definitely.
And I think we need to be a bit careful with how we say experience, because it sometimes sounds like it can be co-opted into like, oh, you've had the experience.
Yeah.
And so like,
definitely,
you're all good and it's a joyful thing. And it's like, this should not be the norm. It should not be normal to steal children.
Yeah.
It should not be normal to send police to families and communities and undertake emergency action. It should not be normal to incarcerate children and young people for, breach of bail conditions or minor offences or anything like that. Like that's not the experience of my people. Our experience of our people is on culture, with community, with country, with something they would probably never have any access or privilege to know. And to be honest, it's ours to keep, so let's keep that in. But, it's just...
Definitely.
I think we've got to be really careful with how we frame the Black experience, because systemically it's generational, and I share my great-grandmother, May Brown, was a slave on her own lands on Kabawee. They use the term domestic servant, but let's just be real, it's slavery.
Absolutely.
My father considered not even human for half his life, subject to abuse in the boys' homes. And then his daughter forcibly removed.
Yeah.
And then we have things like care and protection agencies that are saying you're inadequate to raise your child because you do X, Y, Z, and don't even recognise actually that root, that chain started from you subjected my nan to slavery.
Yeah.
And then you told my father he wasn't even human for half his life.
Totally.
And then you stole his daughter.
Yeah.
And then you said, you know what's best for my care and protection? It just doesn't make sense to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think you touched on so much knowledge and power in that reflection there. And I just want to acknowledge, we'll probably reinforce some of that sort of stuff around, I guess, what I heard around keeping yourself well in these sorts of spaces when you're operating in such a, I guess, critical role and such a sensitive space, and talking about being a futurist and having that foresight and being strengths-based in terms of where we're progressing and moving to in terms of what the future looks like for our young people. And I think that's for people listening that might be sharing similar experiences to yourself and might be navigating their own journeys. I think maybe that's a real strength that they can try and take a little bit of peace away from, in terms of it can be hard in community and in systems to operate in a space of where there's vicarious trauma and there's different stuff that could be happening and navigating. But I think some of that foresight that you talk about around reimagining and understanding where we're going and what that can look like can really help give us some resilience and strength to navigate some of those rocky parts of our journeys, because we know as blackfellas, as survivors in this space, that's a reality of the journey.
And there is a better world, right? Like there's a better world where, we can actually, and I say this all the time, it's cheaper and it's better to just get it right. Totally. And invest in community, invest in prevention, early intervention, steer away from deficits, steer away from constantly putting extra barriers, as opposed to actually, here's a liberating strength and I've got you and I'm going to support you. And I think the mere reality is, and we know this, and as survivors, is a system, we often say the system's broken, right? We say the system's broken. It's not broken. It's designed.
Absolutely.
We look at history, we look at its goal, and it's achieving the goal.
Totally.
If we're talking about KPIs, my goodness, has history and colonisation achieved its KPI of
Absolutely.
family policing and enduring our people to child removal? But it doesn't have to be that way.
Absolutely.
I know the better world, and we talk about that healing and what does it mean to be in these positions and going through that journey. To our mob that are listening, I'll look at the camera now. You have the right to heal. You have the right to a better world, and you have the right to be able to fight for our people, and equally pause, take a breath, and then come back and fight in the way that you may be fighting for our people. I think and this is speaking as a trauma survivor, is our body keeps the score. And it literally sits in our body, our brain, different parts, from our heart to our stomach to our knees to everywhere in our body. And what I would say to mob and community that, who absolutely should be in all of these different positions of oversight and independence, is there is a world where there's also space in our body and space in our mind and space where we get to reshift that trauma, because I kind of use the analogy of like healing our mind and healing the trauma is like turning the radio a little bit. And when you turn the radio and it's hard, it's hard work in the sense of to say I'm going to actually work on it and do that healing, because we should have never been subject to the pain in the first place that we're trying to heal. But do a little shift in your brain, and then there's space. And then with that space, that's where the language revitalization sits in our DNA. That's where the country, the storytelling, I love talking about this stuff more than anything. But that's where that's where it sits when we get to start changing the frequency. And so I think, when I think of mob and I see, in job criteria need to, like, lived experience is recommended, and it's highly, and it absolutely should have higher preference than any of the other roles. let's talk about some lived healing in there as well, you know? And if someone chooses to appoint somebody in a position, what are we doing to safeguard and ensure that, one, no harm is going to be done in terms of to others and to self, but also to strengthen so that person can be liberated and supported.
Absolutely.
You know, I've got an incredible team where some of my team are doing, you know, that they said, oh, I'm studying, is that okay? And I said, absolutely. We're going to support you.
Yeah.
You know, you can still be in this role and in this team and office and advocate. But yeah, I'm proud of you and we're going to back you. You know, because that's the 5 years. When I finish, who comes in next? You know, and I'm thinking long term. And that's how I think. You know, how old people are always thinking. And I never imagined this role would come. You know, I don't want to say my age, but I went to a community welcome and one of the auntie goes, "Oh, Bub, I was expecting someone older," and all the other commissioners call me Bub, and I love it. Like, it's just that safety and that warmth. But, you know, in terms of being here and the youngest ever appointed in this statutory position in the country, for me, that comes with a great responsibility. But you and I both know our old people just drop in healing, drop in knowledge, drop in love, and just got to tune into that frequency because it's there, you know.
That's it. You talked about lived experience and what we can do in the workspace and workplaces to really wrap around so that those spaces do no harm, so that people that bring that expertise can be empowered to flourish in those roles and add that value. And I remember I wrote something ages ago about the difference between lived experience and what I feel like is lived expertise. And I feel like lived expertise is the ability to understand your experience and then be able to take that experience and use that to add value to systems, to design, to whatever it might be. Because I often feel like, you probably know, as you might have experienced as well growing up, is like some people don't always have the same insight into being able to. I come across people that be like their experience was that's the gospel. So like in a sense that I guess what I'm trying to say is like when I think of lived experience, it's like that is your experience. So like your experience of being removed as a child at 10 or 11 is maybe similar, but it's very different to my sister's experience at 7.
Yep.
So you both have lived experience of what that journey is like, and you can talk to that, and it can be really valuable, and it's so critical. But lived expertise is the ability to take that experience and translate that knowledge into wisdom that can add value to speaking back to power, to systems. In a way that is not, in a way that doesn't assert it as an authority.
Yeah.
I can tend to sort of see sometimes lived experience being shared as an authority, and that's where, as a survivor as well, I get a bit like, because we know as blackfellas, as community members, our experiences, our communities, our families are diverse, and our communities don't speak on behalf of business in other places and spaces and different things like that. And it's almost, in some ways, from a cultural perspective as well, even more significant when we think about lived experience and the ability to recognise that one person's experience is nuanced, and it adds value, but it's also important to understand how that is connected to different parts of the journey and stuff like that. But I guess what I'm trying to touch on is when you talked about the workplace, because we see so often the need or the hunger for people with lived experience to work in these spaces and the recognition of the value that it adds when people are there.
Absolutely.
But we don't often see workspaces or professional spaces adjusting what that world looks like so that those people can be well, so that no harm can't be caused, and different things like that. And, for friends of people I know that have, been through those spaces, and family members too, that there's that feel that it's a deficit to to need extra time to process different things, to have the environment maybe look a little bit more differently because they're working in a space that might be triggering at times. I'm not sure if I'm making the most sense, but
You're making sense.
do you understand what I'm trying to say? Like, how do we design places and workspaces that foster and empower people with lived experience to not only be recruited and engaged, but retained and elevated, as opposed to just sort of, being brought in as an add-on and then they're triggered or didn't work out and they're no longer here.
Yeah.
I mean, you talked a little bit about that sort of briefly, but do you have any sort of professional or personal perspectives on how we can start to design spaces to support survivors and people with lived experience?
Thanks, Sam. No, that you made absolute perfect sense. And I think as you were yarning, the words that were popping into my mind were often when those spaces aren't created, it's due to a few things. And there's a few things that I've seen within the workplace, and I also see just externally looking in is power, barriers, racism, performative. And I hear these things because, and I think those words came to me because if you've decided that you are recruiting on the basis of lived experience and people and their stories and what they've been through, then you need to ask yourself as a workplace or an organisation, am I creating a workplace that fundamentally adopts anti-racism principles where we will ensure that employees won't be subject to, and if that employee or whom is subject to any of that, then what am I doing to, like any survivor with lived experience, hear, believe, action, change. What am I doing to that? The power. So often when I see positions of lived experience, it outweighs the Western ideologies of qualifications. And so I see people in higher positions employing on the basis of lived experience, accepting that the Western qualifications don't necessarily hold merit in the process.
Yep.
But then when that person comes into the role, I immediately see a power imbalance. I see that abuse of authority. I see that control. And then what I see happens with survivors and people with lived experience is they're almost subject to that form of abuse again in some way or another, but just by their employer.
Yeah.
And the employer, I'd say they are, I don't like using the word unconscious bias because it's quite conscious to clock yourself, you know.
Yeah.
It's about being self-regulated, and maybe it's not as easy as what I'm saying, but I see the way survivors go into these spaces and often met with silence and not having their voices heard.
Yeah.
You know, I've been advocating with families and communities, and if I'm being honest, I probably started the advocacy space directly at about 21.
Yep.
I ran at 18 from the system, and I started studying and doing all of that, and then you start realising, you know, I've got to help other mobs subject to the system, but equally I realised there were times I had to pull back. But then I've been in workplaces where I'm sitting at tables and I'm sitting at tables with all of these people, you know, someone's a policy researcher, someone's a professor, someone's a lawyer, someone's, you know, a social worker. And then I'm sitting there as a survivor. And because of that, I don't have that formal qualification at that time, or I'm not considered, you know, a doctoral researcher at this point. Suddenly, your skill set as a survivor is completely diminished.
Yes.
And it's not really heard and it's not really practiced. And so I think in terms of the workplace, I put the challenge back on the workplace and say, what are you actually doing to centre survivors and centre their voices? You know, I've been in workplaces where, you know, ethically I would never approve funding from the same people who forcibly removed me as part of, you know, working. And that consideration often isn't had around the table, you know, and what does it mean to give up power? What does it mean to reshift the dialogue? What does it mean to turn your head and say, actually, what do you think needs to happen?
Yes.
And it's not about subjecting that person with lived experience within the workplace to saying, tell us your story, tell us what's happened, But it's about honouring that survivors have a skill set that
Absolutely.
nobody would understand if you haven't survived and if you don't have that survivor skill set. And what I would say is the majority of us as blackfellas are survivors, survivors of genocide,
Yep.
survivors of, the historical colonial violence,
Totally.
survivors of ongoing policing, survivors of family policing, survivors of just trying to make that money last to the next fortnight while you can,
That's it. Survive an off week.
Yeah, that's it. And it sits there, and that's inherent. And I just, I think when organisations don't adopt that do no harm approach, and if you haven't fundamentally put into your policies and your practice do no harm, anti-racism, and recognising power imbalances, then you're going to be met with these issues down the track.
Yeah, I love that.
And I even see it with families, when I'm at a table and I see a significant power imbalance. I see I'm the commissioner, I have a power and I know that. I see, the system that has the authority around where that child may or may not end up. And I see a mum who's been completely disempowered throughout the whole process. And so I sit there and I think, oh my goodness, what's going on in this situation? And my immediate allegiance is to how do we create a sense of equity and equality within this, and might sound cheesy, but within this energy system that we're sitting around right now, because there is no equal empowerment here. There's a historical disempowerment that sits with the history and what this person may be subject to or have been subject to. And then there's this authority that's continuing, the oppressive practices that we've seen in history into today. And so my thing is start empowering people, start empowering decision-making, trust your workers, respect your employees, really, really respect each other. And it comes down to simple caretaking.
Yeah.
I wouldn't walk down the street and disrespect you.
Totally.
So why would you disrespect me? And if you're my colleague, why would I disrespect you? Or if we're in the same workplace, what's the,
Yeah, you touched on something really important there around the authority, and also really resonated with me from a lived experience perspective when you reflected on your journey sitting in spaces as a survivor with lived experience, but not yet having your degree or your credentials, and being in this space with other people and not feeling like your experience held as much weight in those rooms because you didn't hold those other Western credentials and accolades. And I was very much the same. I didn't talk about my lived experience because I just didn't feel like when I was in those spaces that it was heard for so long. And so when I was like, I have to go and get a degree, and I went and got my degree. And then even then I was like, well, I have to get some professional experience. It has to be at a significant level before anyone's going to even respect what I've got to say. And it's only now, like in my mid-30s, where I'm like, I've got master's level education. I've worked at a senior level of government. Now you're going to hear about the lived experience that has underpinned that journey, But that shouldn't have been the case, It should be exactly what you're saying. We need to be acknowledging the power imbalances in the room and reshifting the scales in terms of recognising the wisdom and resilience and strength that exists within survivors. I think you're on the point. I have to ask something because I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. A lot of our community that watches our podcast engages with us through LinkedIn. We're a big LinkedIn for life. Big professional community out there, though, of allies, change makers and mob that are really trying to forge the way in this space. So I put a call out for any questions, and Sis BJ Newton posted a question. And so I've got a shout out to BJ, and I have to ask it. And also, I want to take a moment to acknowledge a lot of the work that her and her team have done in this space as well. I was at a Road to Reform workshop with the minister late last year, and a lot of the work that her and her team had done really just highlighted what we know, right? Like over 30% of kids being removed because of neglect in New South Wales.
And what's neglect? Like, define neglect to
exactly.
me. Like, what's actually...
Exactly, right?
What's neglect, yeah.
Totally. But, really doing... And, just continuing to really add value in that space. So, BJ and your team, thank you so much for what you're doing. But she wanted to have a yarn about she wanted to really understand some of your experience recently overseas.
She knows she can call me. She has my number.
She must know that it'd be a valuable yarn for everyone to understand. But
BJ Newton was, along with Michael Salter, they were my supervisor for my honours.
Yeah,
so
okay.
we worked very closely together, and shout out to BJ as well, because her work's amazing. And in terms of, I know she's using the word reform, but I feel like it's towards abolition.
Yeah. No, she did. I misquoted her. It was abolition. Yeah, she wanted to know.
Yep.
Yeah, so what was it like? What was the experience like? What did you take away?
So I went to the United States for 4 and a bit months last year with my little family. So I was at Penn State. I was at the University of Pennsylvania, and I had the privilege of working with Dr. Dorothy Roberts, who is an incredible, staunch activist, professor, doctor, like, or you name all those flash things. That's Dr. Dorothy, and she works in the area of family policing and the rights of reproduction, women and children, people of colour, and it was amazing. So we worked alongside together where we connected to grassroots community. We're based in Harlem a lot, where we connected with grassroots organisations, one in particular called JMAC, which stands for Just Making a Change. So I'd encourage everybody, particularly here in Australia, if you have the opportunity, look at JMAC and look at some of the grassroots movements happening in the US, because what I learnt when I was over in the United States, which this is the strength, right? When you get to kind of be on the outside, you kind of get to have a bit of a deeper thought process of what's going on within the inside. And by the inside, I mean what's going on in Australia with family policing and incarceration and breach of our fundamental rights. So I had the opportunity to think and to learn a bit more deeper and to reflect with Dr. Dorothy and reflect with the grassroots orgs, JMAC as well, in Harlem at the community college there, which I intentionally picked the University of Pennsylvania because for me there was a bit more of an establishment of working directly with community and the connections with grassroots, like in Harlem and areas of high need of fundamental change as well.
Yeah, no.
And so what I learned just being over there in the United States is, one, I'm even more scared about what is on its way here in Australia if we don't immediately action and call out what's happening now. As you know, I'm sure, I should as you know, but the United States, things like Roe v. Wade were overturned. I kind of dived a little bit more into why this is happening, around reproductive rights, around, non-people of colour wanting to have, more power over people of colour, adopt their children, foster their children, etc. But being over there and looking at how abolition can work in practice, it ultimately was something that I've always felt. So I've always felt we can do things in a better way. I've always felt it's cheaper to do things in a better way. And I've always never understood why we as a community here haven't looked at completely overturning systems change in terms of we know it's not working. We know from every single closing the gap reform, from every single publication that we see from experts in the field, from survivors, from professors, from researchers, is what we have does not work. And lots of people say reform, reform, reform. My dear Auntie Anne Cregan, she always said to me, reform implies that things are working, but it's not working. So we need to abolish it. And so being over in the United States and learning about different ways of community care, the way, and this is, I think we all kind of think and feel when we look at the United States, we say they're a bit ahead in terms of it's a bit of an eye-opener about what could come here,
Yeah.
And that's what I saw. I saw that if we don't actually look at non-reformist reforms, looking at completely shifting the oversight of resources and who has eyes on our children and young people, we are going to lose a whole other generation. And so abolition, and I spoke about this in my TED Talk, is ultimately an invitation for fundamental change. It's an invitation to love and care for each other, and it's an invitation to say, actually, this is your need. I have the resources. I'm not going to inflict further harm on you with what I've identified. I'm going to support you with the resources that I have. abolition doesn't have to be a scary thing. In fact, it's our greatest strength as community. And I believe that we are practicing this as a community on the ground. We practice the principles of abolition.
Absolutely.
But we need to drive that focus towards how are we really ensuring that de-incarceration is being focused on? How are we making sure that children and young people are not being removed? And I'll use an example. Our Boreas Our Way put in one of their recommendations, which was amazing, like an incredible group, to the ministers and said, we need to implement Restoration Task Force. Now, Restoration Task Force has now been implemented here in the ACT, and what that is about looking at where there are potential cases of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people where there's been a change of circumstances and children can be returned to their birth families. Ministers agreed that this is something we absolutely need to do. That is actually a step towards non-reformist reform. That's allowing us, okay, we can't just completely say, okay, we're shutting down everything altogether right now because we need to, what's happening in the middle, what's happened here, and also what's happening over here.
Totally.
So what's happened is actually that's our elders, our survivors, our direct first old people that were subject to things like the stolen generation. But then we have to look to the middle, which is what Restoration Task Force is. We can't abolish this system right now until we make sure our babies and young people who are currently in the system, we need eyes on them. We need eyes on our babies that are in the residential care facilities. We need eyes on our babies that are in non-Indigenous foster homes. And we also need eyes on our babies that are potentially in Indigenous foster homes but not their Indigenous cultural kin and customs and identity of where they come from.
Absolutely.
And that's what we're doing here in the ACT. We're looking at every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, young person that has the prospects for restoration. And then we need to go to the early intervention and prevention. We can't be looking at restoration and then in the same breath doing a removal, because we're just going to be in the same cycle. And so abolition allows us to look at things like family policing, statutory child protection systems, and say, how are we managing the middle to then stop the front, to then say, actually, we don't need this care and protection system to exist because actually, one, we are self-determined people. Two, historically, our mob would be supporting even non-Indigenous mob. You know,
100%.
we would welcome everyone. Our way is a way that so many people get to learn from, right?
Yes,
And so what are we doing to ensure that community have control of our children, our young people, and are making sure that when there are circumstances where problems may exist, which problems do exist, you know, we're not naive to that, what are we doing to ensure we're responding with the least harm as possible without adding more harm to that situation?
Totally.
And when we start doing that, when the power is given up, so this is that power conversation, people need to be prepared to give up their power. People need to be prepared to walk away. When there is an injustice and something wrong, you need to be prepared to say, actually, I don't want to participate in this anymore. And so I challenge people in systems of child removal and family policing, and I say, was it the right call? Why did you do that? What could have been done? Was there a better way? Could you maybe have taken that mum and that child together and said, actually, I'm not just going to do an emergency removal on your child, but I'm going to help you, mum and bub. You know what? We've actually built emergency housing.
Totally.
It's safe and secured, and we're going to protect you from this risk of domestic and family violence. We're not just going to take your child and leave mum there in a dangerous situation. Because I know the night I was removed, I couldn't stop worrying about my dad. I knew he had problems with the drink. I knew that was an issue.
Yeah.
But I couldn't stop worrying, thinking, oh my gosh, is he gonna drink his life away? I was 10 and a half thinking like that. That's how my mind was going.
Totally.
But nothing would have made me feel more comfort in knowing that we were together and safe and he was looked after.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And so I saw a lot of what's happening in the United States. Sorry, BJ, big answer. But I saw a lot of what was happening in the United States around
That's a good answer.
better ways that we can actually support each other. But then equally, I come home and I see the way I speak to elders and I speak to community and I look deeply into their body and their eyes, you know, and you see the lines and you see the fight that our old people have been doing nonstop, you know, the door's open for everyone. You need a bed tonight, bub. Yep. if a child rocks up to your house or a mother drops 4 kids at Arnie's house, that Arnie will have them bathed, clothed, fed, asleep. They'll be right. They'll be looked after.
Totally.
And I see the way our elders have just fought and fought and fought, and they have laid a strong foundation for how we continue that fight. But also, they deserve to know that their strength and their fight to create a better world for our people is actually happening. And I believe that everything we ask for in all the different spaces, and I think we do it in different ways and different words sometimes, but ultimately we all are leaning towards this system needs to be abolished because it doesn't work. It stems from historical pain, historical violence. You wouldn't let the abuser suddenly turn into your caretaker.
Yeah.
So why can we know that there is a history of these systems that have abused and hurt and harmed and killed our people now suddenly be our caretaker?
Yeah, again and again.
You can't do it.
Talk about abolition. I think it's something for a lot of people listening that might be new or sort of early way of framing their thinking around this sort of space. But I think what you sort of really describe is how people can understand abolition in a way that is not so violent. I think people get like you say the word decolonize or you say the word abolition.
You're being radical.
Yeah, exactly. Radical's a better word.
How dare you care about human rights?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think radical is the word, Abolition falls into that decolonized basket with the radicals. But when you talk about it, it actually seems quite straightforward and clear in terms of a logical and reasonable response to an unjust and ineffective way of working. Public resources.
It's not sustainable.
Yeah, unsustainable way of sort of thinking. And, same thing, people freak out about decolonising, but really it's just understanding that there's more than, colonisation taught us to only think within the binary. And there was white is right, west is best. There's one way or the highway, whereas abolition, decolonising thinking recognises that there's this non-binary of thinking, of thought, of way of working, and way of doing.
And it connects to what you're saying about connecting it to colonisation. That's exactly where abolition connects to.
Totally.
Abolition was formed out of the movement in the United States of incarceration, where the enslavement of African American bodies were being subject to alarming rates of incarceration and still continuing today. And it's the same story here. We might be an ocean away, but it's the same story. Totally. And so when we look at abolition as a principle in practice, what that implores our mind and our focus and our research thinking to do in practice as well is to say, well, actually, wait. During the first moments of invasion, they put up fences, they blocked us off, okay, and then they started locking up our people because that was the only system of the penal colony that they knew. And then they realised, oh my gosh, these people are surviving. They're strong. Yeah. Okay, we got to take the children. So then they start taking our kids. And then our kids start growing up. And then they make them into slaves. And then they incarcerate them. And so we need to always connect that abolition was about de-incarceration. And when we look at de-incarceration, we know that there are non-reformist practices kind of leaning towards that. Just reinvest is being spoken about, which has its pros and cons. But ultimately, the step towards de-incarceration and strength-based supports of early intervention and truly implementing abolition is about taking those resources from prisons, taking those resources from dedicated, funding to remove a child or something, and putting that in the early intervention and prevention space. Because you know, if you put money into to build a prison, you're going to fill that bed. Yeah. And you know who's going to fill that bed? Totally. It's probably our mob. That's going to make up that rate. And then when it comes to child removal, you put money into, if you say you have an allocated budget committed to this amount, X amount into removals, you have this amount in case management funding, you have this amount in, long-term care orders and supporting carers. Imagine we just flip that. We reshift the resource and said, actually, you have this amount of money to to support early intervention and prevention.
Totally.
And, you have this amount to support the people doing early intervention and prevention, so they're sustainable in that work. And that's what abolition is. It's about sustainability. It's about love. Love is at the core of abolition, and that's, harm minimisation, and that's the greatest thing.
I often think about, you touched on resources, and this is not directly connected to what you're talking about, but it just made me reflect on something I used to think about as a kid. And we used to say like, oh, Dad, if you got paid as much as the foster carers get paid, Mel would probably still be at home, because we know that, like, to be a foster carer, tax-free, you get compensated quite well to care for children in care, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is bizarre that you would, you're taking kids for neglect and poverty, and then paying the people, more than double to do that role. Just
and
made me
extras
think about
too. They put resources in, like, if you need support with dropping a kid off to school, we'll organise a caseworker to come pick you up and take you to school. If you need extra therapeutic support for the young, where was that support at the early stage?
Just give it to us.
Give it to mum or dad or auntie.
We can see her struggling and help out a bit.
Yeah,
100%.
But that's the racism, and that's the disempowerment. It's automatic, like, oh no, you probably can't manage the funds, or no, you're in the too hard basket, and we need to immediately remove this child.
Yeah.
Awful.
You talk. Can you take a moment to reimagine a world where you talked about, your dad had his things that he was dealing with, and you talked about the day that you were taken, and what would have been maybe a better experience if someone took you and your dad somewhere else and gave him a bit of support and kept you together. Because sometimes when I sat at that reform stuff with the minister last year, I often think, because it's been 20 years since my removal experience, I think, like, it's been so long, it's probably not, things have changed or it's not as valid. But what I'm realising is it's exactly the same what's happening. So I think your experience as a young person is exactly as relevant today for how we reimagine and think about today. But if you could think about reimagine what that experience could have been like in a perfect world. And I'm sorry if it's a sensitive space to take you to.
Done a lot of therapy, Sam.
Yeah.
Good.
But if you could imagine what community care or even a systems intervention could have looked like, that could have been healing, trauma informed and healing led, could have looked like for you. Have you reflected on it? What could it look like? What could people listening that are in this sort of space really try and carry and hold?
I think when I reimagine that better world and reimagine the world I wish existed when I was a young person and child, I think it brings me back to systems recognising the harm that they've done to our people. And I say that because, where I grew up, in Bilga, just near La Perouse there, where Dad and I and Mum lived, a few housing blocks away, we had, and I write about this in my book, but we had a jail. We had a halfway house for sexual predators who had been convicted for pretty horrific forms of abuse. We had a halfway house that was dedicated to them being released. We had a small local community centre called Klura Community Centre.
Yeah.
And then we had a cemetery down the road. And so when I think about all of those different systems that were in play, while some hold a strength, others were ultimately reminding us as children and young people the likely path that we may end up down. When you have children and young people in an environment, and then you have a halfway house for predators and dangerous people around, a lot can get misinterpreted. A lot can get confusing. A lot can be like, what is going on here?
Yeah.
So in my situation, there was lots of misinterpreting, lots of judgment on my father as a black man, lots of judgment on my mother as a woman with mental illness, pathologizing, both of them. And when I reflect on the night that I was taken, and this is me as an adult looking back, having that space now to be like, nobody knew actually what was going on because nobody did their due diligence. But if we had community-empowered support, community would know what's going on. Community would be able to be the first respondent. Community would be able to interpret things correctly. Community would be able to say, actually, no. No one has to get removed here. This is what's going on here, X, Y, Z. And actually, we know Albie. We know him right. He's right. He's an uncle. He's right. Dear friend, he's right.
Yeah.
And help. So when I reflect on my situation as a child, and there's certain things that, literally from birth, because my eldest brother experienced family policing as well, and that was the first insight of the system surveillancing us. When I think of all the different moments of that policing and surveillance happening, it was almost like the system was waiting, when's the right time to grab her? And just anticipating when's the right time. And in their eyes, the right time was the middle of the night when I was about to close my eyes.
Yeah.
I remember it was raining. I was sick in my stomach. I vomited so much. I hugged my dad. It was just, I remember it like it was yesterday.
Yeah.
And they sent the police.
Yeah, ours was Friday night.
Oh, so and it sits there and you remember it.
Yeah.
And when you see rain sometimes, it probably brings back a little, I don't know if it was raining in your city, but you get little memories, maybe when it gets Friday, you get a bit, what's going on, or, and that stuff sits. They don't know how to adequately do their job that's in a safe and trauma-informed way. And so when I reflect on what could have been done better, it simply would have been all those times that you spent trying to blame and punish and target my family, my community. Why didn't you just spend some time getting to know my family and community? Or better yet, why didn't you recognise that maybe you weren't the best person to be doing that job because you spent more time surveillancing than you did actually being proactive and supporting the community needs? I really do believe in community, and I really do believe that Aboriginal community-controlled organisations have the answers. And in my situation as an adult, I actually ended up speaking to, as I mentioned in my little yarn just then, I met with the person who used to run the community centre, Coolora Community Centre, as an adult. And she said to me, she goes, Vanessa, I've been meaning to speak to you for a long time. I said, oh, okay, what about? And she goes, no, I know that you probably have a lot of questions and you're probably wondering why didn't we do anything as the local community centre for you? And I did. I had a lot of questions. I thought, oh my goodness, like another person failed me. Another person didn't come out and advocate for me to stay with my family. And then you learn things. You read case notes, you read files, and you realise that actually a lot of people tried, but it was the system that didn't want to allow that to happen. It was always their way. Best is west. Or what'd you say? West is best.
West is best. White is right.
Yeah, and no one else can have a say in that because that's the fundamental racism that exists within, that ideology.
Yeah.
And so she goes, I just wanted to let you know a couple of things. And she broke down a situation that happened, which I might talk about another time.
Yeah.
I think it's in my book a little bit. But then she said, I want you to know that we had built a whole program and a whole systems of support for you so that Dad would be supported, you'd be supported, and so would your brother. And we did this whole thing, and the only thing that stopped us was when something happened, and then it was known as DOCS at the time, rocked up to the local community centre. I recounted a story, and they decided at some point at one night that they were going to take me. Instead of actually speaking to the local community worker who had been doing that job for many, many years, well respecting the community, everyone would go to her. They completely dismissed it.
Yeah.
No. So listen more, recognise your power, and recognise that maybe it shouldn't be you in that power, that position of power, sorry. Be prepared to walk away when things aren't right. I say this all the time. You need to be prepared because as soon as you're not prepared to walk away when things aren't right, that's your spirit then. And that's your spirit that you're altering and you're touching and you're playing with.
Totally.
And if you can still sit within that place of knowing that something is wrong and still participate, then you're active. And you're active in creating a world that actually isn't the best outcome for a lot of our people.
Totally.
Yeah.
Sound like a really critical opportunity there for that system to have really worked with or invested in that community organisation to be able to do that wraparound program that they had designed for yourself or for your family to provide that support. And, you know, not every young person or family might be connected to a service like Coolora. But
it's completely changed in terms of now. It's completely changed.
Yeah.
But imagine the trajectory. Like our kids are still being taken from that community.
Yeah.
You know, we've got the jail where family members are inside.
Yeah.
So imagine had that program been supported. Imagine how many kids could have stayed.
Absolutely.
Imagine we decided maybe let's not put a halfway house where there is a potential risk, but instead we say within the family home that's the risk.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely. Conscious of time.
I know we could yarn all day.
Oh, yeah, I feel like I haven't even scraped the surface. But I just want to come back to something you talked about earlier about how you often, coming back to where you're at now in your role as commissioner, and you often wondered as a little girl if there was somebody there that cared and was advocating and was doing maybe the work that your work represents, all the caseworkers and lawyers and courtrooms and different things you came across throughout your journey. And you know, that really resonated with me, you know, because so often I would think as a kid, you know, like, why is no one helping? Like, why is no one helping my dad? It was so hard. But
Can make me cry.
what I'm trying to say is it really made me think of that quote, be who you needed when you was younger. And I really feel like you stepping into this space.
You made me cry looking at your eyes.
You stepping into this space is exactly the kind of leadership, the kind of authority, the kind of strength and energy that our families and young people need, you know. And I just want to thank you so much, pay so much respect to you.
Thank you, brother.
Recognise that your work is not easy, and that also give you permission to take care of yourself, because we know healing is a journey. And your whole community is, and your whole people are behind you professionally and personally as well. We love you so much.
Love you too.
And I just want to thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, brother.
Do you have anything you want to share before we wrap?
No, just thank you. Thank you for what you're doing in this podcast and being able to bring different perspectives together to be able to share dialogue in a way that maybe other survivors can look at and understand in a different way. Also the way other people in the field that maybe work with survivors can also look at. I think when you're just saying being the person who you needed as a kid, that's something that lays very close to my heart, because as a survivor after 18 you get to request your documents and you get to read through files and you get to go through what happened, and I read through those files and I see the way things are written about my mum and dad and put my other eye on, and I can see the other side of how much they were just on the margins of everything. And for me, I know that these children and young people will grow up. I know that our babies always want to come home. I know that at some point they will want to find place, community, country. Where do I belong? Where do I actually belong in my heart? Where do I belong?
Yeah.
And one day a child might grow up. They might ask for their case files. They might see all of this stuff that I've seen written already about their parents and their families and their communities. They'll think, oh my gosh, did they have to stop fighting for me, or will they think, oh, maybe that mum had no choice but to stop fighting for me. But then maybe they will see my team's names, and they will see that we did everything. Every child wants to know that they were fought for, they were protected, and they were loved, and that no one gave up. And so I hope that when we are responding to the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people, that they open that and they read it and they say, oh, this is a bit different to the way everything's being framed. What's going on here?
Yeah.
What's happened? What's the gap here? And then that child will know. I hope it just makes it a little bit easier in their future that they are loved, protected, and someone is fighting for them. That's what I'd like to say. And I want it to always remember.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, brother. Love you lots.
You too.